Okay, well, welcome everybody. We'll do as best we can without the slides. They were really just there as sort of bullet points. So hopefully we would have been saying quite a lot more than was on them anyway. So you know, you might, if you have paper and pen, you might want to scribble a few notes because not everything will be on the slides. But we'll do the best we can. So as Norma says, we are from Grant Parish Church, and needless to say, when you're a fundraiser as a profession, you inevitably get pulled into doing fundraising for your church. So we have done a fair amount of church fundraising. I would say we're not experts in it, but we're very happy to share the knowledge that we have. Just a little bit of background about us. Both of us are working as fundraisers all the time. Dan's background was in aviation. He took early retirement from Edinburgh Airport and moved into fundraising, having had his last role as a community relations manager. So in a way, seen it from the other side of the fence, which is a really useful place to be, actually, and gives him a different kind of understanding, I think. And most of my career has been as a fundraiser. For nearly 30 years, I was working with Waverley Care, which is the HIV hepatitis C charity based in Edinburgh. And then just before the pandemic, I left there to join Dan in what we call the Docker Partnership. So that's our freelance fundraising business. Anyway, so Docker Partnership has been running for a few years. We specialize in working with smallish clients who can't afford, by and large, to employ their own fundraisers. So we're very much sort of trying to facilitate small charities to gain access to some of the trusts and foundations, and that's our main area as well, is trusts and foundations fundraising. I have some, or both of us have some experience in other areas of fundraising, but trusts and foundations is really our main area. So the format for this evening, we've got, we'll each take part of the presentation, and we'll just do a little bit of a section on various things around fundraising and some of the things that you might want to think about before you launch into it. I'm also acutely aware that some of you may already have been doing fundraising, and I'm sure we'll have some knowledge to share as well. So it would be nice to keep the evening fairly informal. We've built in some Q&A time at the end of each section, or each couple of sections. So we can do that fairly informally at those points, but you know, feel free to interrupt as well if one of us is saying something that we're just not making any sense. So let's keep that fluid. So I think really I'm going to hand over to Dan to kick us off about what you can fundraise for.
So there's a wide variety of things you can fundraise for. Both of us, as Karen said, our main focus of fundraising is from trusts and foundations. But knowing what you can actually apply for is very important. And the areas that we have developed expertise in is fundraising for capital projects. So that's like bricks and mortar, major equipment. For instance, you know, at Granton, one Christmas just before Christmas 2018, our ancient old boiler broke down, so we were without heating, and that was it. It was condemned. So a major fundraising campaign there for the capital to install a new heating system. That's capital fundraising. Projects are a very important part of our work, especially within churches. So you're basically supporting the additional work that you want to do, especially, you know, to include running costs, salaries. At Granton, just for an example, we have a project called Granton Goes Greener. It's very much an environmental and sustainability project, but we employ a project manager and also one of our elders part-time, who is the administrator. So we actually fundraise almost continuously now to cover the salary cost for that project. And then core costs. Core costs are, you know, the costs of running your church and the additional ancillaries that go with a church for your heating, for the various things that you need to continue working as a church. So core costs, that's a very important aspect of fundraising, and more trusts and foundations are now accepting the fact that charities, so we're referring to churches as charities, I hope you're all registered as charities, do need core costs, do need funding for core costs. So that's becoming an area of fundraising which is becoming more accessible. I'm going to hand over to Karen now. She's going to talk about the current fundraising climate.
Yeah, so we're going to box and cox a little bit, and actually because we're married we probably will interrupt each other as well. So
but I'm session clerk, so I can tell her to be
he's
quiet.
the boss. Okay. Yeah, so just a little bit of background about the current fundraising climate. And I think it's not rocket science to figure out that the fundraising climate at the moment is pretty tough. And that's really, I think in all the time I've been working as a fundraiser, it's never been tougher. And that's prompted partly by COVID, I think coming out of COVID, and also hard on the heels of that with the cost of living crisis. There is a lot of competition for funding out there. Which isn't to say that you can't get it, because it's out there, it will be given to somebody. So what tonight is about is making sure that you are in the best possible position to access the funding that's out there. But it's good to kind of just bear in mind that it isn't a competitive market. We're quite often asked, if we chat to people about fundraising, what would your hit rate be? So how many funding applications would you need to put out there in order to get the money back that you're looking for? In a way, that's a little bit like saying how long's a piece of string. The old equation used to be that you would, if it was a cold funding application, so somebody that you'd never had money from before, you could expect to submit maybe 10 applications for each one that you might get back successfully. And if it was a funder that perhaps already knew your organisation, that might drop to 1 in 4, maybe even 1 in 3. And we will come on to why that is and the importance of relationships a little bit later on. Interestingly, some of the research that's now around seems to be indicating that actually, this sounds as though it doesn't make sense, but the fewer applications you do, the more likely you are to be successful. And again, we'll talk a bit more about that, about how important it is to target those applications. So I think certainly I've been guilty, and I think most fundraisers have been guilty of maybe not mail merging funding applications out to lots of trusts, but certainly firing them out to anybody and everybody. We used to call it the spray and pray approach. And I think that is maybe less appropriate and actually is now less successful than it was. So actually the importance of really having well-targeted funding applications, knowing that the charitable trust that you're applying to is one that you do fit into, that you really genuinely do fit into their criteria, and you're not trying to shoehorn yourself in, or indeed just sending it out there because they're in a directory, is becoming increasingly important. It's probably worth saying as well that fundraising is the causes of the moment change a bit. So a lot of charitable trusts at the moment have because of the cost of living crisis, and rightly so, a lot of their energy is being put into working with organizations that are literally supporting people who are living hand to mouth. So there's a lot of stuff around at the moment about sort of people that are struggling because of cost of living or living in poverty, or a lot also around trauma at the moment. Obviously there is funding for a lot of other causes as well, but I'm noticing increasingly that trusts are kind of, a lot of trusts are moving more in that direction. The other thing we're seeing a little bit at the moment is that some trusts who have been around for quite a long time are winding down, and that can work. It can be a positive or negative. Obviously, in the long term, it's a negative because the money is no longer there. But what sometimes happens is you find that suddenly trusts will have bigger amounts of money to give out because they're wanting to close down within the next few years. So that that can work both ways. The other thing I would say that's really important to hold on to is two things, actually. Don't take rejection personally. If you're going to be sending out funding applications, you are going to get rejected. If you're not, could you please come and tell us how you're doing? Because certainly it goes with the territory. And I think as a fundraiser, you have to have pretty broad shoulders not to be impacted by that. And the other thing, the flip side of that, I think, is that celebrate success. If you in this climate particularly have some fundraising success, tell people, celebrate it. When I left my job that I'd been in, as I said, for many years at Waverley Care, we talked a little bit about that. And one of my parting shots to them was, I don't think we did that enough. And I said, ring a bell. So they actually installed a bell after I left. They installed a little handbell. And I don't know if they still do it, but for some time afterwards, if they got a grant in, somebody would go and ring the bell. And I think there's something really, really positive about that, because it is tough. It's tough. And the other thing is celebrating the small wins. So actually, just before we came to do this, I was on Facebook, and we'll talk a bit more later about fundraising Facebook groups, but I'm part of a trust fundraising group. And there's a fabulous consultant who puts a lot of motivational stuff around on Facebook. And each week on a Thursday, she puts out there, what's your small win been this week? Let's talk about small wins. And lots of fundraisers come back saying, I've got this, I got through to the second round of this, I got a £2,000 grant, and I think those kind of things are really, really important. This is the point at which we thought we'd have our first Q&A, if anybody's got any questions off what we've said so far. John? Sorry, Norman, do you want to do this bit?
No, on you go. You go.
Do it.
You'll need to unmute yourself when you're asking your question. So, John, you're muted.
Right. Is there such a thing as a list of trusts and foundations?
Yes, and we will come on to talk about that, about how you find out about trusts and foundations. But yes, there are several.
Right.
But we're not giving you our list. Sorry.
But we're giving you some.
Yeah, we will.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more?
Ian.
Thanks. You spoke about core costs being something that's available for funding now.
Yeah.
Is there within that, is there something that's just a no-no? It just won't be funded? I know in our past with the church, we found that the funders were happy to provide funding for capital projects for, say, the church halls because it was community use, but not the place of worship.
Yeah.
Is that still the case, or is there a change of heart?
No, that is still the case, but I think you'll find there's an equal number of trusts, especially trusts that will support religious causes,
Right.
that will support the core costs, so capital costs for yes, your ancillary buildings, your halls, but also for the fabric of the church. And there are some trusts which actually concentrate purely on the fabric of the church. So yes, there are funders, and there are a number of funders, who fund both, all the work that you want to do, especially if it's capital work.
I think the other thing it's probably worth saying is that another way to get core costs in, particularly if you're looking at a project. So if Dan mentioned earlier our Granton Goes Greener project, one other way to get money into your core is to cost that into your project. So actually at Granton we've not done that yet. In that Granton Parish Church provides heating and lighting and space as in-kind support. But at one point we did cost that out as to what that would look like. And if we felt confident enough at one point, and indeed if the church really needed us to do it, that would be a possibility. So that's another way of getting and that's quite acceptable, I think, for funders, that you would maybe put 10 or 15% onto a project bid that will cover your core costs.
Gail, I
So
saw a hand on your thing. Were you just clapping or were you asking a question?
I was clapping.
okay, anybody else? So we'll continue. Okay, so researching funders. That's there are a lot of funders out there. There are, I don't know if there's been a count recently, but certainly a couple of years ago there was something like 4,500 charitable trusts in the UK. So it is really a question of researching. How do you research? There are 3 sources of funding, or at least places you can go to look for the information you need. One of those is Funding Scotland, which is the SCVO. Funding Scotland is part of SCVO,
which is Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations.
Sorry about that. And they fund quite a variety of causes. Their criteria are quite open. I'm going to try and adjust our focus a bit. That bit better. It is a bit better. Sorry, I was looking very fuzzy. At least my wife was looking very fuzzy. There's a fantastic comparatively new source of information. It's called Charity Excellence Framework, and that's a website. It's been put together by a Scot who lives in Yorkshire, but he's very fond of finding specific funders who will fund projects in Scotland, but a very, very wide range, and that wide range of trusts and foundations. And he takes an awful lot of the hard work out of the research. And so it's very well worthwhile making a note. And they'll be in the notes. So there is a link to Charity Excellence, and it's well worth a visit. OSCR, so that's the Office of the Scottish Charities Register, is a good source of information about charitable trusts. Not just the trusts themselves, because you can actually find from their annual accounts, because you can actually access their annual accounts of not just trusts, but also other charities. So that's your competitors in a way. And you can find out from annual reports what funding has been received and from whom. So it's a very valuable source. There's one called Funding Finder, so I'm not quite sure if that's Get Grants. Yes, it's the address of that, or the email address or the website address will be on the notes. Church of Scotland website. Church of Scotland are very good at letting you know about various funding sources, especially either within from the Church of Scotland, but also letting you know about other sources of funding. So a lot, that would be in quite a lot of the directories that we're going to come on to later on. So I've said that other charity and church annual accounts, you can get access, as I said, through OSCR. Fundraising Facebook groups. Karen mentioned that. I think she might want to say something about that.
Really, just to say that they are useful to join if you do Facebook and you're going to be doing some fundraising. They are useful just in terms of sharing. You'll occasionally get tips from people who've got money from a funder that you may not have heard of before, or just sort of sharing. So some of the information about what the current hit rates are, what sort of response times are, that kind of thing. And people do share frustrations as well, so it can be quite useful. But and actually, certainly for myself, once or twice I've popped questions in the fundraising Facebook group and had some really helpful responses. So worth thinking about that.
I think the one thing to emphasize there, that it's fundraising, people who work in fundraising, you'd think it would be very, very competitive, but it's quite surprising how much people are prepared to share information. So the final one that I've got of the free sources of research, Grants Online. So you get a free newsletter if you sign up for Grants Online. So again, I'll be providing the website address on that with our notes. But then we come on to the people you pay for. So you would expect, actually, if you're paying for it, you'd expect to have a really fantastic source of funders to which to apply. My Funding Central, which is a low cost resource. And again, the web address will be in the notes. Funds Online. Now, that's probably one of the biggest directories. It's an online directory. It's quite expensive. It's about £400 for a full year's membership. You can actually join for just a week. And this is run through an organisation called the Directory of Social Change. But it is a very, very comprehensive, and it's a very searchable source, because you can actually go in exactly what you put in, exactly what you're seeking the funds for, and it will hopefully come up with a list of funders. Printed grant directories, so you can actually pay. Again, Directory of Social Change produce quite a wide variety of specific directories for specific causes. So one of my clients is a small school in Edinburgh. So I frequently subscribe and will buy the directory once every couple of years, because I've discovered that the update, you've probably had probably half a dozen new trusts added. But I found in my experience that those new trusts are open to application, and I've had success. So what I should be doing is buying that directory every year.
So that's one of the things that comes from the Directory of Social Change, the guide to the major trusts, that you can buy. So it's quite a meaty tome.
Yeah. And then finally, Funding Scotland, and that's.
Yeah, so there are two. We mentioned Funding Scotland in the free section. There are two versions of Funding Scotland. So Funding Scotland is the one that's the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. Again, the link will be in the PowerPoint notes that we send out. So you can access some of that information for free. You can also join Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, which I don't think is hugely expensive. And through that, you get access to a paid-for version of Funding Scotland, where the search function is better, and you can keep lists of the trusts that you apply for, and they just have a little bit more information about that. And actually, I would say probably if you're going to pay for something, that's probably worth doing, just because all of the trusts are Scottish. So Directory of Social Change and those ones, they'll be UK wide. Yeah.
Although with that said, there are a number of the big London-based trusts that will actually fund Scotland. Yeah. So I'm thinking in particular, there's one, Garfield Weston Foundation, which is a huge foundation, which gives a very funding for a very, very wide range, and every church should consider making an application. There we are. So any questions from this section?
Anyone got anything they want to ask? John again.
From writing your application to receiving a negative or a positive response, what sort is the time scale? 6 months, a year?
That it varies hugely, to be honest. A year would be quite long. It can be anything from weeks to 6 months, I would say, on average. Yeah.
Yes, I often it's one or two of the online research directories do actually provide a service to tell you the trusts the trust for which deadlines are approaching. So it might say, I will be looking now for trusts that the deadline is say the end of September, to make sure I get an application in good time. Sometimes if you're making speculative applications, you might have just missed the deadline, and sometimes they will come back to you, very nice of them to do that, and say, we've got your application, you missed the deadline, but it will be carried forward to the next meeting of trustees. So it's always the trustees who actually decide who's going to get the money. Any more questions?
Rita.
Yes, I wondered, we're in that strange situation of a Church of Scotland in England. Now, a lot of the things you mentioned are through the Scottish side. Would we still be able to use these type of funders when we're actually physically over the border?
Oh yeah, I think majority of trusts and foundations, when you look for their information, if it's an English-based or Welsh-based trust, their information will be on the Charity Commission website. And you can Google, just put the name into a Google search, and if that's where the information is, and probably that's the only source of information, you'll get some information. And sometimes it will actually say England and Wales, but it's well worthwhile, because you'll get an address, you might get a phone number or an email address. It's well worthwhile contacting, especially if you see in the other information that they actually support the cause that you are funding for or fundraising for. So it's well worthwhile actually doing a bit of research. Don't just glance at the entry in Charity Commission or the Oscar entry. Do a bit of research, look into them, and you'll get the information you want.
Yeah, so I think in a way that comes back to sort of talking about making sure that the application is really well targeted. So knowing with each charitable trust what their priority areas are, and some may well just do Scotland, but probably not that many, but some may well just be that.
But there are a lot of trusts that will fund Scotland.
Yeah.
Good.
Anybody else?
Move on. Okay.
Okay.
So the next section we're going to talk about, which is kind of in a way the most important section, I think, really, is what makes a good funding application. And I'm a great advocate that before you start, what you need is a document that's called a case for support. And what a case for support is, I suppose in a way it's doing what it says on the tin. It's actually putting on paper the reasons why you need the money and the background to the information, to the organisation that you're representing. So I think it's a really important starting point. And I think that partly because what it gives you, a case for support can be a really long document or a short document. It can be as long or short as you want. And Dan will talk in a little while about what makes a good short funding application. But the beauty of a case for support is you can say everything you want to say in that document. And in a way, it acts as a writing library for you. So that when you are faced with a funding application form where they're asking a specific question or you've only got so many words, you can look through your writing library and hopefully find some good phrases and things that saves you reinventing the wheel all the time. And how I would normally approach something like a case for support for the first time would be to gather together a few people who are involved with the organisation, but also some external people, so some stakeholders. So, for example, if you were going to do a community project based around your church, or you were building a community hall or something, I would involve people from the local community in that case for support. In an ideal world, I mean, we don't live in an ideal world, but that would be the ideal. And the reason for that is what the Case for Support is aiming to do is to give people the reasons why they should give to your cause. And in a way, they're to give them two different reasons why they should give to your cause. So I talk about the head reasons why they should give. So to know that you're a well-established, well-run organization, that you're on top of your finances, that you've, so if you like, I mean, there's a phrase where you talk about kind of hygiene factors. It's that being confident that if I give you the money, I know it's going to be spent on what I'm going to give it to you for, and also that it will be well stewarded. And the other side of the coin, so that's the head reason for giving. Then the other side of the coin is obviously the heart reason for giving. So what is it that actually motivates you as an individual? And let's not forget that the trustees who sit on charitable trusts are individuals. What's going to motivate them to actually part with the trust money? So Case for Support, I think, is a really important place to start. And so what would go into a Case for Support? Well, you would begin by including your mission statement or your vision statement. You would give a good, solid organizational background, so some history to your organization. Often that's the kind of thing that you wouldn't then put into a funding application, but you might pull one or two sentences out of that would be useful to put into a funding application, or they may be a specific question on your histories, and you've then got it there ready for them. I would then include a good chunk of a section on what your current activities are, and talk about all of them. So everything that you do as a church, but also everything that you might do in the community. Just think through every aspect. And again, that's why having external people coming in, what do you mean to your local community? What is that different perspective that you could put into a Case for Support? Why you need the money, that's very important. So being really clear about what you're fundraising for. Outcomes, I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then case studies or testimonials. Obviously, if you're capital fundraising for a building, that may not be so relevant, but if you're fundraising for a community-based project, for example, putting in some case studies about, of somebody who's either used the project, or if you have volunteers from your church participating in something, a case study of what they get out of it as a volunteer, but also what they see, the difference that the project is making. And then what the opportunities are for a funder to get involved. So, what would £1,000 look like? What could you do with that money? What could you do with £5,000? What could you do with £20,000? So those kind of things. Just giving people an indication of what you would do with what level of giving. I had this written down, and I don't know whether this will work quite as well as to what an outcome is and what an outcome isn't, because people often trip up on this one. So the outcome, i.e., what the difference that your project or your building or whatever is going to make, is your outcome. So I'm going to tell you what isn't an outcome first. So I want you to imagine that you're installing a kitchen that is going to be available for community use in your local area. Doing the not first.
Oh, right.
So this is not an outcome. As a result of the new kitchen installation, we will deliver workshops in food and nutrition to 40 local families. So that is not an outcome. That is what you are going to do as a result of having your kitchen. This is an outcome. As a result of the new kitchen installation, 40 local families will have a greater understanding of food and nutrition and the overall impact on their health. So does that make sense? So that's the difference that your project is making. So you would describe what you're going to do with the money as part of so that's talking about the activities that go in the Case for Support, your planned activities as well as your current activities. But the difference that you will make is the outcome. And it's really hard, and they do whole courses on this. Mm-hmm. There's a very good organisation actually called Evaluation Support Scotland, which helps in things like outcomes and measuring your outcomes, because that's another thing that funders may well expect you to do, is to measure those outcomes. So that's the case for sport. And again, we'll come back to that if there's any questions when we get to that bit. But Dan's going to talk a bit about sort of the more generic funding application now.
Yeah, so we'll just take an example that you have a project that you require funding for. Excuse me. So you're going to have done your research into potential funders, and then you're going to sit down and write your funding application. So that funding application is going to, first of all, be, when it arrives, a secretary will open the envelope, take it out, and have a quick glance through it, and she will know through experience whether that's going to be instantly rejected, put it in the bin, or it's going to be forwarded to the decision makers. So you've got your information about your potential funder. Now you may be writing a letter. But a lot of trusts still just want a letter. Others now produce forms. More and more are producing forms. And the majority of the big funders do have forms and guidelines. They actually print their guidelines. So it's very, very important that you read the guidelines. Make sure that your cause that you are seeking funding for is covered by that particular trust or foundation. So either within their funding criteria. You'll often find frequently asked questions on their website, perhaps. A lot of the big trusts have websites, very, very good websites. So make sure that you investigate the website, find out what's in it, and read as much as you possibly can to get to know the trust or foundation that you're applying to. If you're writing a letter, then keep it brief. Have a first draft. Perhaps show it to somebody who doesn't necessarily know your church, your cause, and ask them to read it, and make sure that you haven't include too much jargon. I know that that we are so used to the environment that we worship in. There is quite a bit of jargon, I suppose. Avoid that as much as possible. Keep your language simple, brevity rules. Okay. Application forms. One of the banes of our lives is an application form, and they don't actually give you a word count to the different sections that you're answering. So you'll spend probably a couple of hours. I always, and I think Karen does this as well. In fact, I know she does. In fact, it was her who told me to do it. Write a list of all the questions in a Word document. And if there's a word count, make a note of the word count and start your funding application. Write it in a Word document and keep checking that you've kept within the word count. Okay, quite often, if they don't give you a word count, you'll sit and you will have written your wonderful section, answered this particular question. You cut and paste it into the form, and it will tell you, oh, 600 words too many. So you then got to go back to the drawing board.
There's something in there actually that occasionally you get tripped up by you think it says word count, and then you realize it says character count. So
yes.
2,500 words. Oh, that's a big long answer. Oh no, hang on a minute, that was characters.
Yeah, so, that happens very often. Yeah, and don't forget to save. If you're filling in a form, they usually will give you a facility to save the form, and so you can come back to it. So you've logged into that particular trust's website. You'll have a name and possibly a password. So it's easy to just log back in again and then continue where you left off. Playing up or playing down faith-based focus, you'll find that there will be trusts and foundations that will not support religious causes. So you've really got to delve there whether it's a religious cause, if it's a community facility that you're trying to fund, something which is, a project which is going to benefit your community and not necessarily the church.
I think I'm just going to, sorry, Dan,
yeah, that's
jump
all
in
right.
here, because I think this is a tricky one. It's a tricky one for churches to do, but it's important to think it through. So, for example, Granton Goes Greener is funded by the Robertson Trust, and the Robertson Trust are very clear they will fund churches and they will fund. So their main area of work is around poverty and trauma, which that project ticks those boxes. But they are very clear that they won't fund an organisation won't fund a project which is overtly pushing the Christian faith. So we are very clear that that project, in its current guise, does not overtly push the Christian faith. It clearly is taking place in a church hall. There are posters all around. We have our values and our mission statement and everything around the place. So we as Christians hope that subliminally the people that access the project will know where we're coming from, but we cannot be seen to be pushing faith, and that can be a hard place to be, as a Christian, to kind of feel that you have to compromise that in some way. Mm-hmm. I think it depends how much you need the money.
Yeah. Sometimes when you have the information about the trust in front of you, perhaps from a directory, it will give you a list of all the questions that they want you to answer in your written. So if you're writing a letter, make sure that you answer all the questions. Very, very important. So.
Dan, can we do some? I think we might have some questions at this point because there was a lot of stuff.
Carry on.
In there. Anyone got anything they want to ask? No questions. Okay. Keep going.
Okay.
Okay. So the next section really follows on from what we've just been talking about, and is around relationship building. So about sort of building a rapport with your funder. So I mentioned at the beginning about this kind of hit rate and applying to trusts cold, but also then that you're more likely to have success with organizations that have funded you before. So sustaining relationships is really important, and beginning to build relationships is really important. It's not easy. So if you're feeling brave and you want to phone charitable trusts before you apply to them, and you have the time to do it, that's a really good thing to do, because you're then immediately beginning to establish a little bit of a rapport. You're also making sure that you're going to fit their criteria, and that can sometimes be really helpful. That said, a lot of charitable trusts are managed by solicitors and accountants, and my personal feeling is I don't think they welcome phone calls other than very quick ones to check deadlines or eligibility, but you're not so much building a relationship with them. But certainly some of the bigger funders, having a pre-application phone call is no bad thing. When you receive money, obviously thanking the donor is really, really important, and doing it quickly is really important. And then certainly all of the bigger funders will have an expectation that you'll report back on their grant. So they want to know how the money has been spent, that you've spent it on what you said you were going to spend it on. And again, where we talked about outcomes, that's where they will be looking for you in that report to demonstrate how you've achieved your outcomes, or indeed if you haven't, that's the point at which you can tell them, well, we were going to do this, but we had to do this instead, and this is why. And actually, trusts certainly the bigger trusts are very open to that. I think I'm a great believer in being open and honest with your funders and not saying things that you haven't done. I was chatting to somebody actually just yesterday about so it's an organized, very small organization I work with that had previously said that they worked with a lot more families than we're now saying. And there's a new operations manager has come into post, and sort of basically she's saying, I don't understand this. How is, on one level, we're saying the demand on the service has gone up, but if I look back several years, the stats are showing me that it's actually gone down. And the reason for that is that they weren't collecting statistics properly. So those statistics were really kind of finger in the air. And this is what we think the funder would like to hear. And obviously what that then does is the point at which you report back, you either have to keep that fabrication going, which I would absolutely say don't do, or you have to be honest. So yeah, I mean, complete transparency and honesty is really, really important, rather than trying to tell the funder what you think they might want to hear. The other thing is that if you say, for example, you're fundraising for a capital project, or even for any project, actually, invite a funder to come and visit you. There are not many that will, but some will. So, the more that you can build that relationship, the better, because at the end of the day, as I said, the trustees are people. And I think the old adage that people give to people is actually very true, even in the sphere of trust and foundation fundraising. So that's kind of it really on relationship building. Is there anything anybody wants to ask on that particularly? No.
Any questions at this point? Put your hand up. No, you're good to go. Good.
Great. So we're getting fairly near the end now. Just a few general points, and then we'll talk a bit more specifically about funders. I think one really, really important point is that funding has to follow the vision. So don't ever be tempted to go for a fund because it's there and try and create a project to fit the fund. It's very tempting when you see a big pot of money there and you think, well, if we did this, we can get that money. The vision has to come first, and then your funding approaches have to come second. And the reason for that really is because the project has to be sustained at the end of the funding period. So if you're chasing a pot of money that's only 1 year funding or even 3 year funding, at the end of that period, you either have to wind the project up or you have to sustain it. So definitely don't chase the funding. And I think also, just as a general point, to say that fundraising is time consuming. And is quite hard work. If it's a load you can share, I would really encourage that. And I guess also saying that writing funding applications is something that it's a skill that you build over time. And I think Dan's point about asking people outside of your own brain to read over it is a really good thing to do, so that you get some external perspective on that. So find some nice, friendly Presbytery clerk or somebody to to read over your funding application.
I have to say, at this stage, I think the actual job of fundraising is a lot easier than actually talking about it.
Okay.
Right.
So that's a sort of kind of a few general points. Dan's just going to talk a little bit now about this is probably easier to do on the slide, but we'll talk about some of the major funders.
Yeah. So Church of Scotland, there are a couple of sources of funding that we know about. Seeds of Growth Fund. And before you all joined us, Norman was telling us that he's just been successful in getting some funding from Seeds of Growth. There's also that's good. There's also a small grants fund. So the web addresses for both of these are in the notes. There is another trust, which is an England-based trust, which used to be called the All Churches Trust. They've now changed their name to the Benefact Trust, and they will fund a wide range of topics and projects, capital, wide range, both England, Scotland, and Wales, and Northern Ireland.
Just to jump in on that, actually, I was having a little look at them earlier, and as Dan says, they are very, very wide. One thing we haven't touched on yet, actually, as part of this presentation that does apply to Benefact Trust is the area of match funding. So for Benefact Trust, they do expect you to have 30% of the money in place already before you can apply to them, and that is the case with some other funders as well. Not all of them, and actually one or two that used to do it have now kind of slackened that a little bit, but they certainly do expect you to have 30% in place already.
Yeah, I've mentioned the Garfield Weston Foundation. I think they are possibly one of the most generous of the big foundations. I mean, they give millions of pounds a year to various good causes, and they're open to projects, to capital. Go onto their website. It's an excellent website, and it's quite a straightforward application process. There is a form, but it's just a very basic form with the information that they require about yourselves, about the organisation, about the church. But then it's unlimited, almost unlimited pages. I said earlier to restrict your written funding applications to 2 or 3 pages. They encourage you because they give you a list of all the questions they want answered. So it's a long process. But in my experience, and our experience, it's a very worthwhile experience. Go on their website, have a really good look at it. National Lottery funds. So you've got the Heritage Fund, you've got Improving Lives, you've got Awards for All. Again, very good websites. Look at their websites, look at your project, and find out which one will fit.
So I'll just jump in on Improving Lives. That's an interesting one. So that's the National Lottery Community Fund is Improving Lives. So that's not a capital project. Obviously, that's about about people, about kind of revenue projects. But they have an unusual application process actually, which is that they want you to speak to them before you even think about applying. So you have to contact a funding officer. I'm not sure if that applies as well with Heritage Lottery, does it? Maybe.
I think so. Yeah.
So you actually get to have a conversation with a funding officer beforehand, and they may well. And in fact, actually, I have just done this with my Granton hat on for Granton Goes Greener. I had a conversation with a grants officer at Improving Lives who actually told me that she didn't think we should apply. And it's much better to know that, because that's a fairly meaty funding application. It's much better to know that than spend hours and hours or days putting an application together and then find that you're just not eligible. So useful.
Yeah. ASDA Foundation. So I'm just putting ASDA Foundation there because I mentioned earlier that we were successful in getting funding to install a new heating system at Granton. And ASDA Foundation, because they're one of the big supermarkets within our area, and I discovered how to get in touch with their local champion. So that's an employee who is basically the person to liaise with the community. And that was not an onerous application process. It took some time, but we did end up getting half of the funding we needed for the new heating system. The Baird Trust is a Glasgow-based trust, and they specifically fund churches, all aspects of churches, so that's capital and projects. Scotland's Churches Trust is one that's currently closed for applications as they review their grants programme and their priorities. But but it's well worthwhile going onto their website and becoming a member. We were successful in getting some funding, and I decided that £50, managed to persuade our treasurer that £50 a year was worth it. We've actually had funding twice for projects, for capital projects. The Robertson Trust is one that Karen's mentioned. They're huge in Scotland, and it always seems to me as if they want to give money away. It's a very, very good funding application process, and they're very, very cooperative. So they're very, very helpful. Another one, Mary Brown Memorial Trust. We've had funding from them for our Granton Goes Greener project. And then another one that we got funding for our church windows. We wanted to install secondary glazing to the actual church itself. And we got quite a substantial amount of funding from the Scottish Landfill Communities Fund. Again, I've put the website to Google, and that will give you all the information. But the money is basically coming. You've got to be within a certain area of where a landfill is happening, but they're pretty general. So it's not a if you don't think there's a landfill site within 30 miles of you, don't worry, just apply. Russell Trust, this is one that's got no website, but you have to get in touch with them for an application form. Hugh Fraser Foundation, another quite big Scottish charitable trust. Again, we've been successful in receiving funding from them. And then the last one I'm going to give you is the Lane Families Trust. It's an English-based trust, but they do give funding. There are a number of trusts within the Lane family, so each member of the family seems to have their own trust, but it's one application will be looked at by all of them. So all of these are on the information that you'll receive. So I think there's
just any other
we've
questions.
come to the end of our slides, which you haven't seen, but you will receive.
Sorry, Dan, one thing just to chip in to folks in the Lothian and borders is to remember wind farm money.
Yep.
So if you're in the area of a wind farm, they're awash with community grant giving.
Funding Scotland is a good site to go to, and they list all of the wind turbine sites.
So we're very grateful to Dan and Karen for giving us their time and their expertise and their experience, and whatever else they are, they're living proof that this can be done. We can put it that way. Any questions as we come to the end? What's kind of struck you that you might want to ask a wee bit more about, or anything else? Because I've got to tell you, once they're gone, right? Ian.
Thanks. We've been speaking a lot about applications for projects. Is this projects that haven't started yet, or can it be projects that are in progress?
It can be either.
It can be either, but it cannot be retrospective. You can't ask for money. You spent £10,000 on a project, and it's finished. So then go and ask for money. You won't get any money for that.
No.
Yeah.
But usually people are quite clear in their guidelines as to whether they will only fund new, or whether, I mean, hopefully trusts are moving away from always having to do new stuff, and recognizing a little bit more now that people actually need to carry on what they're doing rather than trying to invent stuff all the time.
Yeah. Neil and Pennycook, you've got your hand up.
There we go. Thank you very much. I have a particular question which may be relevant to other people as well. We're a recent union, and from sale of various properties, we appear on paper to have a lot of money available. In practice, because of charities law and because of Church of Scotland rules, a large chunk of this is probably not accessible how much of a deterrent is it to funders if you appear on paper to have plenty of cash, albeit not ready cash?
Karen will answer this one. Restricted funds.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing is that you can explain why you've got them. So, I mean, sort of Oscar's guidelines are that you should really have between 3 and 6 months running costs. Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of churches will have more than that, and you know, but there can be a very good reason for that, because you're, you know, maintaining a hugely expensive building, or which is why it's important, I think, in accounts to either, well, restricted funding is money that is given for a very specific purpose, so you can only restrict it if it's being given for that purpose, but there's nothing to stop you designating funds. So your elders can your Kirk session can designate funds in accounts, and you know, that can be a way of explanation. So, for example, I mean, funnily enough, at Grantham we have a similar problem, or not problem, but situation at the moment, where actually, if you look at our accounts, it looks like we've got a year's running costs. We actually don't, because of expenditure that we have coming up that we know we have to do, and actually we are now in the future accounting years going to be looking more at designating funds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Pauline.
You mentioned wind farms, and Wilton Church in Hoyk, so we are literally surrounded by wind farms. And what sort of things do they fund? I ask simply because a couple of years ago we had to have like £13,000 worth of repairs to the church heating system, and we applied for grants all over the place and didn't get anything. So we had to fundraise money ourselves, which was, as you can imagine, a huge thing. And there's a couple of things that are coming up that need done that are not as large. But what sort of things would the wind farm thing, would you be able to apply to them for? Is it anything, or?
I think it's mainly community benefit.
Right. Okay.
So anything that's going to benefit your community. So that's the community that you are serving.
So if we need a disabled ramp, then that
could well be covered. Yeah, I think from what I believe, I haven't had any funding from any wind farm, but I think that the grants tend to be smaller. They're not huge grants, but I think they like to spread the money, you know, as widely as possible.
Pauline, if you drop me an email, I'll put you in touch with Susie Fletcher in Dunglass, because they've done a fair amount of wind farm. They've received a fair amount of wind farm funding in their church, so you can kind of hear it from someone who's gone through the process.
Right, that would be great. Thank you.
Anne?
Yeah, actually, I was the same. We were discussing this last night for funding Massey Church. Where did you say you found out where all the wind farms were? Because
it's on Funding Scotland, so that's the SCVO.
Right. Okay.
And I think that's the more general. So it's not. I'm not quite sure if it's on the free source of
it should be.
funders. It should be, but if you actually join, and it's not expensive to join the SCVO. And you'll be paying for Funding Scotland, but it is quite a comprehensive site, quite valuable.
But mostly for community funding and projects
mostly
that benefit the community.
Depends on the company that actually is running the wind farm.
It seems to be, because it seems to vary from area to area.
Yes, yeah. So it will vary. So yeah.
Cute.
Dan?
Hi, sorry, I just wanted to say that at Stow and Heriot, we have been successful a couple of times in getting wind farm money. And it seems that as long as you can prove community use of some sort, the wind farms are willing to provide some funding. So for example, we carpeted the whole of our church was it's not an inconsiderable amount of money, and that came from Wind Farm project, and also I think it was the bell tower or something at Heriot Church. Can't quite remember. It was a building thing anyway, and they covered that too. But we had to prove community use, so you know, pipe band concerts, that sort of thing. And they seem to be happy to give the money if you can prove community use.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any question that they wish to ask? Can I, on your behalf, then extend the Presbytery's thanks to Dan and Karen for taking the time not just to deliver tonight, but also the time to prepare and put it all together. And, you know, just wherever you are, we thank you very much.
Thank you.